Welcome and welcome back to those who have joined us for previous iterations of this series, which we've called I'm a Cultural Jew, Get Me Out of Here. And the attempt is to try and understand aspects of Jewish culture that aren't necessarily about religion. It's a common misconception that Judaism is a religion. It's actually a religion plus a lot more stuff. And so we've looked at a variety of those aspects before, folklore, and today we're looking at criminals. And we will, in due course, get a chance to look at other aspects as well. We talked about art, we'll talk more about music, but the bad is part of the culture as well as the good. And it's actually quite interesting in some way to look at the history of Jewish famous bandits, criminals, and pirates, which is our goal for this evening, because it's something that I think we all feel quite keenly. So I'm going to share my screen with us. And I've got some notes that hopefully will help us to get to know some of these individuals. Can everyone see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Awesome, thank you, Nick. So I put there. It originally titled it "Bad Jews" and then put in brackets "for the," because I think a lot of times when we think about Jews behaving badly, what upsets us more than anything else is the fact that we feel responsible for their bad behavior. So prepare to feel responsible for a whole bunch of Jews behaving badly. As I think the question is it just that sometimes Jews are people too, as one of my professors made a point of constantly saying in our classes? Or is it that actually when Jewish people do things publicly that are shameful, it actually affects all of us? We certainly talk about it that way. We talk about something being either good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. I'm afraid some of these people are not one or the other, but sometimes both. So, um, wanted to try and go chronologically and try and do a survey of some interesting people. Unfortunately, it's no statement about criminality or about Judaism, but they all happen to be men. I think it's more a statement about the historical record and the fact that, unfortunately, due to patriarchy, most of the records recorded are about men. But the man I want to start with is actually all the way back in the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism in the first century, a guy named Menachem Ben Yehuda, who you probably won't have heard of unless someone like that got called up to the Torah last Shabbat. And he was someone who had a big influence on the development of Judaism as we know it. His father was a guy named Yehuda, who had previously led a rebellion against the Romans in the year 6 in the town of Gamla, if anyone's been, it's in the north of Israel. And in Gamla, he had tried to stage a rebellion against the efforts of the Romans to impose a tax and to do a census. Now, Yehuda, Menachem's father, died during that rebellion, but Menachem in his own time, some think he's his grandson, not his son due to the time, but it doesn't really matter. He ended up taking up the same kind of banner of rebellion against the Romans. And during the official rebellion against the Romans, the Great War, as Josephus calls it later, Menachem led the faction which were called the Sicari. Now, they were called the Sicari, which is a Latin term, because of the daggers they carried, which is what's in the image on the bottom left of our screen there. A sickle-shaped dagger called a sika, which was commonly carried by all sorts of people, but in particular became the symbol of this group of basically terrorists, which were led by Menachem. He combined together some religious ideas related to his father's opposition to Roman census, related to memories of the Maccabean revolt, with actually a life of criminality. The Sicari were somewhere in between a cult and a gang, as many terrorist organizations are today. There's kind of both a religious element and a criminal element to it, hand in hand. And actually, the Sicari are probably the first kind of religious gang terrorist group which is recorded in our history, and that obviously is a mode that's continued to have a lot of impact, even up until today, when we think about organizations like ISIS or Al Qaeda. So the Sicari were famous for using these daggers called sika because they would use them to kill other Jews, usually in public, who had either not agreed with them politically or refused to pay the extortion that they were asking or the blackmail they were putting against them. And they became known as both political extremists, in that they wanted to stage a rebellion against Rome and force the Romans out, but also religious extremists, in that they would attack any Jews they felt were too assimilated. And they combined together several criminal enterprises, classic ones that we'll see many times over this evening: profiteering, racketeering, and aspects of kind of blackmail and coercive control over especially business people in order to make sure they could raise the funds for their rebellion. They not quite single-handedly, but largely single-handedly started the rebellion against Rome and the war that sped out as a result. And Josephus, our only real narrator of the events of the first century, holds them responsible for the failure of the war, which, of course, one of the results of the failure of that war was the fall of the temple in the year 70. One of Yehuda's only real achievements was that he succeeded in taking Masada, which at this time was the kind of winter palace of the Herodian king, right? The King Herod, who was Roman client king. He was Jewish, according to some, depending on how you define it, it's complicated, but he wasn't beloved by the Jews, and certainly not by the Sicarii. And so they succeeded in climbing up and taking Masada, which was a big coup. But when he got to Jerusalem, he decided he was actually going to take it a step further, and he killed the high priest and the high priest's brother, so that neither could continue the lineage of the high priesthood. And the other leaders of his extremist faction didn't agree with this particular gesture and the hubris that they saw him displaying in claiming that he was now in charge. And so he actually ended up killed by another member of his gang and his cousin, named Eleazar Ben Yair, who then took over the leadership of the Sicarii and the several other gangs related to them. Side note, by the way, some people think that the name Yehuda Ishkariot, or Iscariot, as recorded in the New Testament, Judas Iscariot, is a reference to the fact that he was a Sicari, rather than the place that he was from. So there probably was some very real world implications for these individuals in both the story of Judaism and Christianity. David, I see you. Yeah.
Yes. I'd like you to help and draw a line, or where you think that line is between crime and how you mentioned the terrorism. Is a criminal automatically someone who is terrorizing other people, or is the terrorist automatically a criminal because of what he does?
Yeah,
She
listen,
does.
one man's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. And this is a great example of people who, according to some, are liberators and freedom fighters and righteous rebels, and according to other are criminals and terrorists and gangsters. So I'm not sure where the line is. It's not so easy to draw, but I think it's an interesting thing for us to keep in mind because we're going to see a few examples, even quite modern ones, where actually we might feel somewhat sympathetic to the cause of people who are committing criminal behavior, as in illegal, but sometimes for a cause that we might relate to. It's not always so black and white, as we know. So let's come back to it, see if we get any more insight. Especially because our next fellow is a rabbi. So we really get to know him better. Some of you may have read or heard about the stories of Reish Lakish. Reish is a nickname. His actual name was Shimon Ben Lakish. And he was one of the leading rabbis of the Talmudic period, the early Talmudic period in the 3rd century. And he was born in what's now Syria, a town called Bosra, but he was known as one of the central figures in the rabbinic circle in the town of Tzipori in the Galilee. I put here big and chunky in quotes because there's a huge amount of jokes or references, not sure how humorous they're meant to be, in the Talmud to Reish Lakish's size. Evidently, he was very big. Not clear if they meant that as he was unhealthily big, or what we might call fat, or whether they mean that he was just really, really big and strong. But probably the latter, considering that we know from his own description in the Babylonian Talmud and those of his friends that when he was young he had sold himself to a Roman nobleman to be a gladiator. That's the way it worked, is you actually usually sold yourself out of poverty, desperation, or adventuring to be a gladiator. And he fought in Rome in the gladiatorial arena successfully because he survived, and eventually managed to buy back his freedom as a gladiator and left for a life being a highway bandit for many years. And it wasn't until he had a chance encounter, according to the Talmud, with who we know as Rabbi Yochanan Bar Nafcha, an encounter that's romantic in many ways, in that these two men find each other bathing and remark on each other's beauty, and they struck up a friendship, which also led to being family, because Reish Lakish not only then leaves behind his life of banditry and crime, but also becomes a rabbi and starts to learn from his friend Rabbi Yochanan, and actually ends up marrying Rabbi Yochanan's sister, so that it all becomes very closely related. We don't really have ages described, but we roughly get a sense that he's about 30 to 40 when he leaves behind his life of crime and becomes a rabbi. And he teaches for a good kind of 30 years as a rabbi. He's very well respected. Nobody really, references or talks about his past previously as a gladiator and a bandit until one day he gets in a debate with his brother-in-law, stroke friend, Rabbi Yochanan, about what kind of knives are used in the temple and what causes impurity on knives. And they disagree about the question of which knife is which. And Rabbi Yochanan flippantly makes a, I guess, rude remark to say, oh, well, you would know, wouldn't you, Reish Lakish, because a robber knows his own tools. Right? The implication being, oh, well, you know knives because you were a highway bandit and a gladiator. And Reish Lakish is so scandalized by this and so hurt by his friend brother-in-law's accusation and reference to his past that he ends up becoming miserable and dying from sadness, according to the story. Which is quite tragic. Obviously, there's more to the story than that, but it shows the degree to which he struggled to incorporate his past as a criminal into his identity as a rabbi. And when the two came together, especially confronted with his friend asking him about knives, he couldn't handle it. So he taught lots of different things. One that's quite interesting in light of his own background, that one of his teachings that's quoted often in the Talmud in discussions of criminal behavior is that no one commits a crime unless they're struck by temporary insanity. So he had this idea, principle, that actually criminals are always vulnerable in some way, that no one's consciously going out to be a criminal, that someone who's either lost their mind temporarily or is in a situation in which they have few choices. He seems to understand much more than perhaps some of the other rabbis in his circle who lived in relative luxury, what it really meant to live a rough life and a life of violence. So it gave him a great insight into many of the questions that come up in rabbinic law, including questions around how to prosecute criminals and how to hold a trial. So couldn't talk about Jews and criminals without mentioning Reish Lakish, the rabbi bandit, and not the only rabbi who has been subject to accusations of being a criminal, but probably the most famous. Um, oops, hang on. Oop, there we go. Nope, nope. Right. Moving on, jumping, unfortunately, a huge amount of time in history because the records for a lot of Jewish communities are quite poor in between the end of the Talmudic period and the beginning of European record keeping, and especially early modern record keeping. The next really interesting moment to look at in Jewish history around Jews behaving badly is piracy, and particularly the golden age of piracy in the 16th and 17th centuries. Of course, we have a lot of conceptions about piracy from Pirates of the Caribbean and swashbuckling movies and people who say "arr," whatever else. But actually, a lot of the key elements of the golden age of piracy, as it's called, had nothing to do with criminals out on the sea trying to steal and rob and pillage, but actually was a political maneuver that many disadvantaged peoples or kingdoms or polities that were struggling in a war used as a tool of warfare. And Jews played a big role, in particular, in the piracy that went on in the 16th century against Spain. Now, the reason it was particularly Jews who were so keen to play a role against Spain is because most of those Jews who were pirates, families had been kicked out of Spain not too long before. Two of them, quite notably, are our friend here, Sinan Reis, which is a Arabic title, Reis or Rais, same as Rosh in Hebrew, meaning Sinan the chief. He was also known sometimes as Sinan HaYahud, Sinan the Jew, and he served as one of the most significant pirate captains of the Ottoman Empire's attempts to fight off Spanish influence during the 16th century, especially probably the 1520s and 30s. He appears to have been from a Sephardi family that fled Spain, but we don't know much about him. We only really get to know him in the historical record in Ottoman archives when he becomes a pirate based in the Greek island of Santorini. where he serves on behalf of the most famous and violent Ottoman pirate in history, who was known by Europeans as Barbarossa, of course, a Latin-based term for red-bearded, but actually his name was Hayreddin, and he has many other titles in Ottoman records. He was the most famous hero of pirates for the Ottomans. He was so called Barbarossa because he had a red beard. Those who know anything about Islam will know that there's many aspects of Islamic culture in which red beardedness is seen as an attractive trait, and many men dye their beards red, even if their hair is not, and he was probably one of them. And he was legendary as being a fierce pirate who scoured a lot of Spanish ships across the Mediterranean. Now, Sinon was his second in command and fought under him, and in particular was given the task of targeting the Spanish fleet for revenge missions. And it's explicitly laid out that way. He won a very famous battle that was quite decisive, a place called Preveza off the Italian coast in 1538, and he was so notable and so hated by the Spanish that the King of Spain, who was also the King of the Holy Roman Empire, because at the time they were the same, Charles V, actually went under an absolutely elaborate conspiracy to kidnap Sinan's son, which he did on the sea, and he kept Sinan's son captive in his court for about 20 years. And Barbarossa actually worked quite hard to try and get his son freed, which he eventually did when he was an adult and he was reunited with his father. But the drama of his son's kidnapping became a big part of his life. Not only was he out for vengeance because of the crimes against the Jews by the Spanish, but also out for vengeance because of the personal crime of Charles V having his son kidnapped from him. So he figures quite prominently in a lot of Ottoman legends and is often just called for short the Great Jew because he was so significant in the piracy that went on across the Mediterranean during that time period. Little map here of what the Mediterranean looked like during that time period, just to get a sense. The Ottoman Empire, of course, included everything that is today Greece and large parts of the Balkans, as well as what's today Turkey and a large part of what is today the Middle East, including the land of Israel. After they defeated the Fatimids, they included everything that was into Egypt. So the entire eastern half of the Mediterranean was dominated by the Ottoman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire, which was Austria, lots of the kingdoms of Italy, and at times parts of France and Spain, dominated the western half of the Mediterranean for a long period of time. So you had a large amount of conflict between those two large kingdoms. The third big player, obviously, who has the rest of the coast, is what became known as the Barbary Pirates, based on the fact that they were Berbers, native people of North Africa, who took up the advantageous position of playing these two large Christian and Muslim countries against each other, and in particular targeting many Christian ships who were trying to pass through the Mediterranean, especially around the Straits of Gibraltar. So one of the most famous people associated with that is, I believe, a descendant of one of the people here, who was known as Shmuel Palace, and he was actually from quite a famous family, even in Spain. His father, so he was born in 1550, but his father, as a young man, was the chief rabbi or the rabbi of the city of Cordoba in Andalusia, which is one of the last elements of Spain to fall to Christian domination, and was the center of Jewish life in Spain as well. That's where Maimonides had been from and many others. So the Palace family were very famous and well known. His father was a rabbi, many of his brothers were rabbis, they were statesmen and diplomats, and they were well-known people throughout Spain at the time. He went a slightly different path in his own life, in that he evidently was interested in seeking out adventure. So he moved at a fairly young age to what's now the Netherlands. And at the time, the Netherlands had only recently been a Spanish possession, but they had managed to get their independence. The Netherlands was one of the first countries to gain independence in Europe from a larger empire. And the Dutch fought against the Spanish for their independence, which they succeeded in, and as a result became a haven for open-mindedness to some extent, but also for those who didn't like the Spanish, which of course during the early 16th century were predominantly the Jews. So a lot of Jews, especially Jews from Spain and Portugal, fled to the Netherlands and moved there. many of them, as we know, still are an identifiable community, known as the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. And of course, the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam is a major attraction even today. Many of them were the very wealthy Jews of Spain as well, so they had a lot of resources behind them. And Palace was no exception. He acted as a diplomat because of his connections and because of his fluency in Arabic between the Ottomans and the Dutch republics where he lived. And actually, although he did engage in piracy against the Spanish on behalf of both the Dutch and the Ottomans and the Moroccan emirs who he had known growing up in Fez, he wasn't really a pirate first and foremost. He was a diplomat who also had a fleet of ships that once in a while engaged in piracy. He's gotten a reputation thanks to some popularized books as the kind of rabbi pirate, because I think it seems like quite a sexy idea. But actually, probably wasn't much of a pirate in the way that the Sinan Reish was that we saw previously. He actually was captured by the English when he sailed too close, evidently, to Britain and his ship ran aground. He was eventually ransomed by the Emir of Morocco, but he was never quite the same and evidently died of illness in Amsterdam, where his grave is still today. The photo here is of a contemporary book in Israel about him, a biography, which is translated from the Dutch. And the most famous depiction of him is one of Rembrandt's portraits, which, if this loads, looks like that. It's quite a striking portrait, and it's not labeled as being him, but art historians have quite conclusively decided that this is a portrait of him, or that at least he sat for the portrait, as Rembrandt had painted many prominent members of the Jewish community in Amsterdam, and Palace would have been no exception. The rabbi pirate. It is a gorgeous turban, yeah. I don't know much about Rembrandt, and maybe Sarah can say more, but I don't know how much these outfits that he painted people in were costumes, like that he had them wear for the sake of the painting, or whether it was actually what they wore day to day. I suspect it was a bit of a costume.
Yes, I wouldn't know.
Well, there is a pirate
My
in
le-
their family.
What do you know about him? He's an ancestor of yours, Sarah.
an ancestor of mine was a pirate. I feel better that they weren't necessarily bad people.
No,
He wasn't the one who was painted by Rembrandt in the family.
oh, I see. So that's right. A different ancestor was the Rembrandt portrait. But yes, there were many people in Amsterdam at the time who were involved in piracy against the Spanish, and Palace might just be the most famous, perhaps. Jumping ahead somewhat again now to the 18th century, we again come to a combination of criminality and religiosity, right, which wasn't so much a feature of the pirates per se, although they both were identified as Jews and were clearly very involved in Jewish life, and many of them had relatives who were rabbis and prominent in Jewish community. They weren't necessarily religious people. Jacob Frank, who we meet now, is a different story. So in the 17th century, in between the pirates in the Mediterranean and Jacob Frank here in Poland, there was a very significant aspect of Jewish life in which approximately two-thirds of the Jewish community in Europe believed that a single man named Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah. It's quite a bizarre story and something we've largely forgotten and don't really talk about that much today. But between 1626 and 1676, Shabtai Tzvi absolutely captivated the Jewish world, and many people, based on Protestant expectations for the end of the world, believed he was the Messiah and that it was all going to be coming to an end soon. Unfortunately, it did come to an end when Shabtai Tzvi, in order to prove he was the Messiah, went to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul and proclaimed himself to be the Messiah and told the Sultan that he now needs to convert to Judaism. And the Sultan said, well, or we can kill you. So it ended up that actually Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam, which caused a huge earthquake across the Jewish world, even in Western Europe, where he was a long way from, because a lot of young people, especially, there was a whole generation of people who were very influenced by Shabtai Tzvi. It was the beginning of the printing press being something that was mainstream. There was the first time there was kind of opportunities for quick information to be shared across the continent. And there was a lot of messianic expectation about the end of the world, particularly centered on the year 1666. Also plays a big role in the English Revolution and the killing of King Charles. So that huge schism, heresy of Shabtai Tzvi is still having after effects on Jewish life today, even in 2022. But one of the more immediate after effects was that it encouraged other people to similarly claim that they were the Messiah and to develop these kind of eccentric, schismatic Jewish cults. And one of them was this guy, Jacob Frank. So he was probably the strangest. He claimed that he himself was the reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi, and considering it was exactly 100 years after Shabtai Tzvi was born, he was trying to tap into what was still then a very confused, but ultimately still a movement of people who wanted to follow Shabtai Tzvi. He suggested that actually Judaism needed to be based on principles around a trinity, of which he was one of the three figures of the Trinity. And he suggested that the only way to cleanse Judaism was to engage in all the things that are prohibited by halacha, in order to then redeem them. So he had this very strange messianic idea that involved basically committing crimes and calling it holy. So his followers kind of went out of their way to violate all the aspects of halacha they could, both kind of, working on Shabbat, but also eating things that aren't kosher, but also sexual crimes, violent crimes, business crimes. Basically, you had a kind of orgy murder spree going on around the Jewish community in Poland and Lithuania in the mid 18th century. And a lot of it centered around the personality of this guy, Jacob Frank, who gradually grew more and more of a cult figure. And he had quite a few people follow him. He was very influential. Part of the reason he was very influential is because the Christian leaders around him loved him. They loved the idea that there was this Jewish rabbi who actually was saying things that were very Christian and was rejecting a lot of the things they didn't like about Judaism. They held him up as a kind of model Jew against the rest of the Jews. The Christian bishop of Podolia, where he was born, arranged several debates where he could debate with the other rabbis, and then they obviously said that he won the debates, and then they burned the Talmud, and he was actually used as a puppet by the Christian administrators in order to do more violence to the Jewish communities around them. He in turn had so much animosity towards mainstream Jews that he accused them of blood libel. He, a Jew, accused other Jews of blood libels and claimed to find evidence of it. And because he himself was Jewish, the Christian authorities believed him more. I mean, pretty bleak stuff, really. And not only kind of a criminal and an egotist and a cult leader, but also a pretty deep traitor in many ways to the essential aspects of Jewish community. He ended up eventually getting arrested and spent 13 years in prison, but in prison lived like a king, and it only increased his legend as being someone significant. And when he got out, he had even more followers. His daughter, who he named Eve, had kind of cultivated a lot more followers, and a lot of it was centered around her as an object of sexual attraction, and also around this idea of committing all the sins that are prohibited by halacha. And eventually, he lived out the end of his life in a huge mansion surrounded by followers with a lot of money and a lot of influence. And when he died, the movement continued to kind of spread out in different ways. It kind of dissolved, but there were lots of people who identified as being Frankists for a long time after. And even more recently, there's people who you'll meet who say, oh, well, our family were Frankists who grew up in Poland. And over the couple hundred years since, it's developed in all sorts of strange ways. One curious way was that a lot of the Frankists after Frank's death went and got involved in the French Revolution. And they were some of the people who supported Napoleon the most. And there were a large part of them who believed that Napoleon was the new Messiah. And so you had these Lithuanian Polish Jews who had been involved in this bizarre cult who were going to France to fight for Napoleon in order to claim that now he was the Messiah. It's all really bonkers. It's hard to believe it's history, actually, when you get into the story, but it is. And the strangeness of it is something that's continued to be appealing. The Nobel Prize for Literature was given in 2019 to Olga Tokarczuk, who wrote a huge novel called The Books of Jacob in Polish, which was translated, actually it was earlier, 2015. It was only translated into English a year ago, but I believe it was published in Polish 5 or 6 years ago. It took them half a decade to translate it into English because it's such a large book. But it was a pop hit in Poland, and this massive, weighty novel imagining kind of historical fiction about the Frankist movement. So even though he's quite a fringe figure, and we don't really talk about this sort of thing in Jewish spaces, had a really big influence on the non-Jews around him, and there's echoes of his cultish influence even in contemporary Judaism today. Jumping again, I know we're jumping a lot. We move into the 20th century and into a very different kind of Jewish criminal. Perhaps you've heard a little bit about the role in which Jews played in a lot of early gangster scenes in America. In particular, there's a few and two who had a huge role in developing the American mafia. First one, a guy named Ben Siegel, who was mostly known as Bugsy, which is a name evidently he hated being called, because it was a slang term at the time to reference someone who's kind of crazy or jittery, which by all means he was. But he was born in 1906 in New York City, grew up extremely poor to one of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jewish families that had emigrated from Eastern Europe and come in complete poverty through Ellis Island and settled on the Lower East Side and Williamsburg and lots of impoverished neighborhoods in New York City. He had lots of friends on the streets as a teenager, and they quickly started to develop all sorts of criminality. Famously, he set up a kind of protection racket when he was like 11, in which he persuaded all of the food vendors who had kind of fruit stands or whatever on his street to pay him $1 so that he wouldn't set their stands on fire. And anyone who didn't pay, he set their stands on fire, and he quickly started making money simply by threatening people as a little kid. So he was the first recruit and the best friend for a time of Meyer Lansky, who we'll look at in a minute, who is probably the most famous Jewish mobster in America. And the two of them together ran bootleg operations during Prohibition in the late 1920s, early 1930s, including all the way up and down the eastern seaboard. He gained a reputation as a hitman, and was one of the key leaders of an organization called Murder Incorporated, which, I mean, it really does what it says on the tin. In this case, the mobsters of the 1930s and 40s did not hide what they were doing, and they were very open about the role in which they played in society. It's hard to imagine to some degree now, although maybe not. But Murder Inc. was basically a cross-communal outsourcing of hits. So the Irish, Italian, African American, and Jewish mafias all joined together to kind of outsource and combine their shared murder quotas. And they had different hitmen from different mobs serving and working for other mobs. So it was harder for the FBI and other organizations to find them and to trace them. It's quite brilliant in some way. So Siegel was one of the people involved in setting that up. Did by all means quite a few of the hits himself, but mostly started to train other people, and was more of a leader of it. Things evidently got a bit hot at the end of the 1930s for him in the East Coast, and he was sent by Lansky, who was running the Jewish mafia at the time, out to the West Coast, at which time there wasn't much presence of organized crime, in order to open up a kind of branch on the West Coast. There's mad stories about him showing up in Hollywood. He basically was friends with everyone who was a celebrity in the 1930s and 40s in Hollywood. All the famous movie stars of the golden era of Hollywood were actually very closely related to organized crime, including Siegel. He had a big mansion in Beverly Hills and lots of lavish parties, and he met all sorts of people through his connections with gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, and murder. Unbelievably, one of the people he met was Benito Mussolini, who at one point came to Hollywood, and Bugsy Siegel tried to sell him a bunch of guns for his new fascist army that he was trying to build. Evidently, Mussolini didn't buy them. few years later, he ended up meeting Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Goering when they came to Hollywood, and he famously said that he didn't care for them, and wanted to kill them, but someone talked him out of it. Not sure who. While in Hollywood, he gained a reputation for doing basically what he did as a teenager, kind of a protection racket, but with the movie studios. So he would organize unions and then convince the unions to all go on strike, and then tell the movie studio executives that they had to pay him in order for the union workers to go back to work. So he turned the unions into a instrument of his own blackmail scheme, basically, quite successfully, made a huge amount of money, no one really knows how much, hid most of it in a variety of places, and ultimately his career as a criminal was cut short at the age of 31, 41, when he was shot in the head in his house in Beverly Hills by a sniper, because he was in charge of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, which was failing, and probably the hit was taken out by the people in his own organization, the other members of the Jewish mafia. He actually played a huge role in the creation of Las Vegas, as it is now. In the 1940s, there really wasn't such thing as Las Vegas, and it was Siegel who had this idea to set up a whole bunch of gambling casinos, hotels, prostitution rings, etc., all in one place to create, as we know it today, Sin City. So it was largely the brainchild of the Jewish mafia, which is somewhat troubling. And Siegel was one of the people most responsible for the idea of Las Vegas and its implementation, although he didn't get to see it in full force. However, his old friend, Meyer Lansky, outlived him and lived to the ripe old age of 81. He also had started out in New York City as a teenager. The two of them, Bugsy and Meyer Lansky, had had a kind of teenage mafia they called Bugs and Meyer Mob, which sounds incredibly unprofessional. Lansky was very focused on gambling. He was good with numbers. He was called the mob's accountant. He also was good at networking, and as a young man realized that the Italian mafia and the Jewish mafia had a shared goal, which was criminality. He started developing personal relationships and professional relationships with key members of the Italian mafia, the Cosa Nostra, particular guy named Lucky Luciano, who was hugely influential in the Italian mob at the time. It's a strange testament to his organizational skills, but Lansky did two things that actually made the mafia from a loose group of criminals who were operating in their own little bubbles in America to a full-blown nationwide criminal organization. One is that he set up something called the Atlantic City Conference in 1929. It was actually his honeymoon, with his wife, was going to be in Atlantic City, also like Las Vegas, a home of many casinos. And while on honeymoon, he decided it would be a good opportunity for all the mafia bosses of all the different groups of criminals in America to all have a meeting. So for 3 days in May 1929, there was basically a summit of all the mafia groups in America who all met together like a conference at a hotel in Atlantic City. The Italians, the Jews, the Irish, the African American groups, all the other groups, all sorts of small time criminals, and they had a conference in which they basically kind of agreed to work together rather than apart under certain lines, understanding that the main enemy to their shared exploits was the government rather than each other. Actually, a surprising amount of cooperation occurred, including the creation of an organization called the National Crime Syndicate, which sounds incredibly officious, which was a official body by which the Jewish mafia, the Italian mafia, the Irish mafia could all communicate with each other, share best practices, resources, and of course, one of the things that came out of that was Murder Inc., as I mentioned, an organization which shared the resource of hitmen between the different mafia groups. Surprisingly effective organizer, and very good with the kind of leadership and acumen to organize and design these organizations that brought together all these different groups that previously had been killing each other. He also, confusingly, tried to do some good things, we might say. One was that he organized quite a bit of street violence against alt-right and Nazi groups in America, kind of the equivalent of the Battle of Cable Street in the UK. Famously, he went to a big rally held by the Charles Lindbergh Associated American Nazi Party in New York and just beat a bunch of people up, mobilized the Jewish and Italian and Irish mafia all to join him in that. He also was hired by the Navy to use his mafia connections in order to get the mafia to protect the submarines and ships being built in Brooklyn Harbor because they kept being sabotaged by Germans and by German affiliated American Nazis. And so you had a bunch of Jewish mobsters patrolling the harbors in New York for a few years during the war, protecting the government ships from Nazi saboteurs, which, you can't make this stuff up. History is a lot stranger than fiction. Although Siegel was his best friend, when the Flamingo went upside down, it was probably Lansky who had him killed, although he later claimed that he didn't and he regretted it. It's no doubt that the hit came from him and from the National Crime Syndicate. And although Siegel died quite young, Lansky lived out the rest of his life. He, however, didn't have so much success because after Siegel's death, he got very involved in Cuba. Under the leadership of the dictator Fulgencio Batista, Cuba was a haven for the mob. All of the mafia started moving their assets to Cuba. They built other casinos in Havana. They basically paid off the Cuban state to make it a mob country. And Lansky was the biggest of those. He financed a huge amount of Batista's repression of the Cuban people, etc. During the 1950s, he basically spent all of his time in Cuba. And as a result, during the Cuban Revolution, led by Castro and Che, etc., 1958, the hotels and properties that the mob owned in Cuba were taken over. Gambling was prohibited, and all the hotels and all the properties were nationalized, and Lansky lost almost everything. So he lived out the second half of his life, from 1960 to 1983, as a pretty normal person, actually. He lived in Miami Beach, as many Jewish retirees did at the time and still do, lived in a condo. When he died, on paper, he had almost no money, but there continues to be speculation about whether he hid money somewhere or passed it on to relatives or buried it under the sand in Miami Beach. There's all sorts of wild theories. But the most likely is that he actually lost everything in Cuba and ended up just living out a fairly normal life for the rest of his life. This is him, of course, as an older man in Miami Beach in the photo. Have to have a British one in here because we wouldn't want us to think that the only Jewish criminals are American Jewish criminals. And indeed, there was a famous Jewish mobster in the 20th century in the UK, born Jacob Colmer in Mile End, but mostly known as Jack Comer, or Spot, is his nickname. I left the mob's accountant there from the other one, but that wasn't what he was called. He was much more hands-on, perhaps, than Lansky. Joined in gangs at age 7 to fight the Irish gangs lived across the street from him in East London. He was actually one of the key people behind the Battle of Cable Street. And after the war, he organized a group called the 43 Group, which is mostly Jewish service veterans of the British Army who organized themselves to fight street battles with Oswald Mosley's Union Party, or whatever it was called after the war, into the 1950s. He attempted to organize what would have been one of the biggest heists of all time on Heathrow Airport in 1952. If he had succeeded, it would have been worth something like £1.25 million at the time, but he failed in the heist. And after that, really started to kind of struggle and get attacked by some of the other mafia people that he had known, including when he was walking down the street in 1956. He was slashed in the face by one of his old enemies, and the rest of his life he had this, as you can see in the photo, huge scar across the center of his face. He gradually kind of retired from mafia activity, and like Lansky, lived out his life in relative obscurity, died in 1996, by all accounts, penniless. It's possible that a lot of these guys were just really good at hiding stuff and decided to go under the radar, but actually a lot of them simply weren't that good at keeping all the money they made through these criminal enterprises. One person who was really good at keeping the money they made, and our last Jewish criminal, is the one of our own time, and the one who I think inspired me to think a little bit about this topic, actually. And when I was at JTS in New York City, the whole scandal about Bernie Madoff broke. I'm not sure how much of a news it was here in the UK, but in the US Jewish community, especially in New York Jewish community, it was humongous. large amounts of Jewish organizations fell apart. Dozens of notable Jewish investors and philanthropists lost all of their money. A lot of people died by suicide. And Bernie Madoff lived through it all. So he started actually a real stockbroker firm, although just penny stocks when he was a kid in 1960. The feds still don't know whether it was a scam from the start or whether he only started making it a scam in the 1990s, but most of the people who knew it best say that it was a scam from the beginning. And basically, he spent his entire career, for about 40 years, um, in the most elaborate Ponzi scheme ever recorded. He managed to make himself chairman of NASDAQ, which is one of the regulatory organizations in the New York Stock Exchange. There started to be complaints only around the year 2000 from financial regulators who were investigating his books and thought there's no way he's making as much money as he says for his clients. He basically took lots of money from his clients and managed to circle it around so that the clients that are paying in were paying out to other people without any more money actually being made and any profits being filtered to himself and his family. It's hard to estimate, evidently, but he probably stole about $65 billion, which is largely inconceivable to me as to what that actually looks like. His criminal enterprise was hugely intertwined with his family members, his wife, his sons, his daughters, their relatives, his friends, and almost everyone associated with it is either in prison or died by suicide, unfortunately. And it has been a really grim episode in American Jewish history. He committed something which I don't think there was a word for before called affinity fraud, which is that he particularly appealed to Jewish organizations as a Jewish investor and managing a Jewish fund to invest in him, and used the fact that he was felt to be more trustworthy by them because of his personal connections as a way to take even more money. So some of the biggest organizations that he stole money from were things like the WZO, the Women's Zionist Organization, JTS, the Rabbinical Seminary, and the Elie Wiesel Foundation, in addition to lots and lots of others. Many philanthropic charities went out of business when it was discovered that all of their money was gone. And the impact is still being felt very really on the New York Jewish community, where almost everyone either knew Bernie Madoff or knew of someone who knew Bernie Madoff, or at some point had given Bernie Madoff some of their money. So it totals out to be the largest recorded fraud in history. He died in prison last year of kidney cancer, I believe, of natural causes. And of course, because the money was never there, there's nothing to be recovered. So it's not like it can be paid back. So the effect that it's had will have probably long-term damage. Looking at all of these unfortunate Jewish criminals and thinking about the question of, is it good for the Jews when there's bad Jews? I wonder what you guys think about what to take away from this. Is it simply that Jews are people too, and there's good Jews and bad Jews? Is there something particular about these stories that upset us or interesting to us? Are any of these stories new to any of you? I'm curious what you guys think after our survey of Jewish criminals of the last 2,000 years. Fortunately, there's more than I could fit in the slideshow, I have to admit. So if only it was only those 12.
So if no one else is willing to say anything, I'll say what Herzl said, that the state of Israel would only be a Jewish state once there's Jewish criminals living there, or something in those. I'm probably misquoting the exact words.
I think it was said. Jewish thieves stealing from Jewish shop owners,
and then it will be a fully accepted Jewish state. So that's one side of what you're asking. Is it just Jews are just people, and therefore there's good people, bad people, so what difference does it make? However, in the Talmud, it does talk about how we should be a light to the nations, or not just in the Talmud, but there's specific instances where that is mentioned, and it's said that, you know, almost a mitzvah, is that we have to be examples to the world and not to be criminals. And therefore, I suppose if we are criminals, then we're not just being criminals in civil law, but I suppose we're breaking the halakha as well. Definitely when things like Madoff, Maxwell, even recently Ghislaine Maxwell, or however you pronounce that name, I never know. Whenever things like that happen, and you say, is it good or bad for the Jews? It's bad for the Jews because people say, look at the Jews. So that's the idea that we should be allied to the nations. And the answer is, but we are just people.
I think we have a strong responsibility to set a good example, because people look at us and take us as the Jew they know. And if we do things that are criminal, it looks bad, it represents the religion badly, not because they may look unfairly, but they may not have other experience.
Yeah, especially when it's so public, as I think it was with certainly the Bernie Madoff case, probably not the Jewish pirates. Probably wasn't the same PR machine. But yes, I think it's an escape. Although, so I was very convinced by my professor who used to say, Jews are people too. And I think that's a good reminder, actually, to recognize that no different really in any way. But we both hold ourselves to a higher standard, as you say, David. And I think we are in some way held to a higher standard by the history of anti-Semitism. And as a result, it perhaps impacts us a bit more. We see things that are good and bad. We're very proud when we see Jewish achievements, Jews in the Olympics who do well. Things like that really people relate to, even though they're complete strangers. I think we're also very ashamed when we see people who are behaving badly, and particularly maybe tapping into some stereotypes as well, which I think is one of the things that is often most triggering for people.
I think it's probably true of all minority sections of society. I'm sure Muslims would say the same. The Asian community of Britain would say the same. That they would feel exactly the same. They would turn around and say, but we're just people like any other people. But when someone of that community is splashed across the headlines as being a first-rate criminal, often white-collar crime, more often than not, people will say, "Oh, look at them," and they'll feel bad, and they'll feel, "Oh, they're giving us a bad name."
We are people like the same as anyone else, but they should also have and do often follow the best example possible. So I think everyone equally should set a good example for themselves, as people.
Yeah. Well, what's certainly seems to me is that however we might feel about these difficult individuals, and they're all each complicated in their own ways, some more straightforward than others, it's part of our history. And I think that as we learn about Jewish history, and as we learn about all the good things, and we learn about all the sad, big, tragic things, it's also important to learn about individual people, the good and the bad, because in each case, it's an illustration of some aspect of Jewish history. And each of these individuals is a window into a moment in Jewish history, just as we are into our own time. So I think it's good to take some time out once in a while to learn about the bad guys. And I'm glad that you good guys could join me to do that this evening. Hopefully not an inspiring thing to take away as to how to run a mafia organization in Hertfordshire.
Too late. I had to start when I was 11 years old or 7 years old. Now you tell me.
Oh, you're in too deep now, David. But hopefully it's been as interesting to you as it has been to me to learn about these strange and complicated people who are part of our own history and our own people. So yeah, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much.
And we're back in 2 weeks' time, I think. And I think we're talking about comic books. So join us then for from villains to heroes.